They tried to bury it. But what had been hidden for over 1,400 years ended up speaking louder than 1,000 human voices. Have you ever stopped to think if there are words of Jesus that the world has never heard? Words that have not been forgotten, just silenced, until now. Imagine discovering, on the shores of the same lake where he walked, an ancient testimony that changes everything we thought we knew about Peter. It is not a legend, nor a supposition, but something set in stone, preserved as if time had been prevented from erasing it. What science took centuries to discover, faith has recognized for generations. Peter was not just a disciple, he was chosen for something greater. And today, you will see with your own eyes the proof of a calling that echoes from the heart of the gospel. Stay until the end of this video, because something divine is about to be revealed. And perhaps, as you hear these hidden words from Jesus, you will never look at your faith the same way again. For decades, scholars have scoured the shores of the Sea of Galilee in search of a missing city. It was no ordinary city, but the supposed home of three central figures in the Christian narrative. As great empires crumbled and other civilizations flourished, this small village disappeared from maps entirely. No clear record, no visible structures, only fragmentary memories in ancient texts and pilgrims' accounts. How could a place mentioned so directly in the Gospels have become such a thick mystery? The answer may have been buried under layers of sediment all this time, hidden by the seasons, the floods, and the silence. In the 21st century, a group of archaeologists discovered more than just fragments of walls or tools. They found something that could change our understanding of one of the most debated figures in the Christian faith. It raises a question that has echoed for centuries. What if a simple stone inscription, forgotten for more than 1,400 years, holds the key to confirming not only a historical location, but also an ancient theological belief? The writing was clear, crisp, preserved with almost supernatural precision. This was no ordinary dedication or building record. It was a statement of spiritual authority, a rare title, a symbol of leadership attributed to Peter, not just as a disciple, but as a figure of primacy among all the followers of Jesus. This did not originate in the heart of Rome, or was shaped by the political structures of the Middle Ages. It was there, on the shores of the same lake, where the biblical narrative locates the first steps of faith. This mosaic fragment carries a message with more weight than many volumes of theological treatises. It confirms that, as early as the Byzantine period, local Christians recognized Peter as having a role that went beyond the ordinary mission of the apostles. And the most impressive thing is where this was found. In a church forgotten by time, built on an even older settlement, whose origins may be directly linked to the New Testament. What makes this episode all the more fascinating is the intersection of faith, history, and archaeology. It's not uncommon for major discoveries to occur in unexpected contexts, but it's unusual for them to have such direct implications for religious tradition. Rather than ornate relics, it was simple stones, carefully arranged in geometric patterns, that brought to light an ancient testimony of spiritual leadership. A church floor reveals what centuries of debate have failed to erase. For those who grew up hearing about Peter as the fisherman who became an apostle, this discovery offers something new. It not only changes the geography of faith, but also the perception that many have about the origin and legitimacy of certain titles. For the first time, there is physical evidence that these ideas circulated in Eastern Christian communities long before the institutional divisions that marked the later history of the Church. And that changes a lot of things. The narrative that has formed around this inscription challenges both those who doubt the historicity of the biblical accounts and those who see Peter as just one among many disciples. There is a linguistic clarity and a theological purpose that cannot be ignored. At a time when everything seems subject to revision and deconstruction, this mosaic not only resists, but also reaffirms something that many thought was just tradition. From this point on, the line between devotion and evidence begins to blur. When the earth reveals its secrets, it does not always do so with a bang. Sometimes, it is in the silence of a forgotten flaw that history screams loudest. And now, that scream is beginning to be heard. The landscape around the Sea of Galilee has changed over time, but one question has persisted, like a shadow stretched across the centuries. Where exactly was the city of Bethsaida? Few places mentioned in the Gospels have generated so much debate. The city is cited as the birthplace of three apostles, Peter, Andrew, and Philip, and the setting for important episodes in Jesus' ministry. Yet for many centuries, no one could pinpoint with certainty where it was located. This uncertainty has not arisen from a lack of interest. Since the 19th century, archaeologists, theologians, and explorers have devoted continuous efforts to locating the ruins of this ancient fishing village. The difficulty, however, has always been linked to the geographic transformation of the region. The level of the Sea of Galilee has varied over time. Land has been flooded or abandoned, and ancient structures have been buried by mud, vegetation, and layers of later occupation. The first major modern attempt to identify Bethsaida occurred in the second half of the 19th century. German and American researchers suggested that a site known as Et Tel, located about 2 kilometers from the present-day shore of the lake, might be the site they were looking for. This hypothesis gained traction and was widely accepted for a time, but not without reservations. The main criticism was geographical. For a village whose name, in Aramaic, means house of the fisherman, being located so far from the water seemed contradictory to the nature of life there described in the biblical texts. Another problem was the remains found at Et Tel itself. Despite significant ruins, the clearest evidence belonged to the Iron Age and to phases prior to the 1st century. Roman evidence, more directly linked to the time of Jesus, was scarce or absent. This led many scholars to reconsider the hypothesis, although tradition had long established Et Tel as the most likely candidate. It was only after the Six-Day War in 1967 that the situation began to change. With the reopening of previously inaccessible areas, new research could be conducted, and a lower region, closer to the lake, began to attract attention. This new site, known as El Araj, showed promising characteristics. There were found fragments of pottery, remains of buildings, and signs of continuous human presence from the Roman to the Byzantine period. But it was from the beginning of the 2000 years that El Araj gained relevance. Systematic excavations, led by archaeologists such as Mordecai Aviam and Stephen Notley, began to reveal a sequence of historical layers that pointed to an active village in the 1st century. Tools, coins, and structural elements allowed the identification of a functional urban environment consistent with the profile of a community linked to fishing and life by the water. More than that, the location favored a plausible reconstruction of the gospel narrative. The short distance from the lake, the natural accessibility of the region, and the layout of the ruins supported the hypothesis that El Araj could, in fact, be the ancient Bethsaida. Little by little, the archaeological fragments began to dialogue with the biblical accounts and the writings of pilgrims from the Middle Ages, creating a mosaic of information that strengthened the connection between the excavated site and the vanished city. This quest was not limited to satisfying historical curiosity. Correctly identifying Bethsaida meant shedding light on the daily lives of some of Christianity's most influential figures, understanding the context of their first encounters with Jesus, and reshaping the setting of the events narrated in the Gospels. Geography is not just a backdrop, but a vital element in understanding the impact and trajectory of a message that has spanned millennia. As the excavations progressed, not only stones and objects emerged, but also forgotten stories. A group of Byzantine buildings were unearthed, revealing the existence of a church built many centuries after the apostolic period, but which may have been built with the intention of preserving the memory of a sacred place. The elaborate and well-positioned structure suggested that the builders knew what they were doing. They had not chosen this location by chance. This detail introduced a new dimension to the mystery. If Christians in the 5th or 6th century built a church there, it is plausible that they did so based on local traditions or information passed down orally over generations. Early Christianity placed great value on sacred geography. Places linked to the life of Jesus and his followers were venerated with buildings, pilgrimages, and rituals. Reconstructing the past, in this case, meant more than archaeology. It was a gesture of devotion. Little by little, therefore, there was no longer just a search for ruins. What emerged was a dialogue between different times, between biblical narratives and layers of soil. The evidence did not speak only of a lost village, but of a continuity of memory, of an attempt to preserve something that was not restricted to stone or clay, but that involved belief, identity, and tradition. Thus, what began as a purely topographical investigation also became a spiritual journey. The name Bethsaida, so often repeated in the texts of the New Testament, gained new weight as the terrain revealed its hidden layers. The enigma, previously trapped in imprecise maps and historical assumptions, began to unravel, not through the force of theory, but through direct testimony from the ground. And this testimony was just beginning to be understood. The progress of the excavations at El Araj has brought a new layer of understanding to the history of the region. With each meter of earth removed, a scenario that previously seemed to belong only to the realm of possibility has been reinforced by concrete data. The soil on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee has revealed much more than simple traces of habitation. It has exposed, with impressive precision, the traces of an ancient, active community immersed in a context of faith and pilgrimage. The archaeological work carried out by specialized teams involving universities and research centers was meticulous. Over the course of several seasons, formally beginning in 2016, a series of structures began to emerge. Among them, a construction that stood out not only for its size, but for the complexity of its architecture. It was a basilica from the Byzantine period, with a central nave, side columns and floors decorated with geometric mosaics. This type of building was not common in any village. Churches built with such characteristics generally served as places of great importance for the early Christian faith. They functioned as spiritual reference points and also as destinations for pilgrims seeking to connect with sacred events or characters. In this case, the site seems to have been chosen not only for its strategic location, but also because it carried a meaning inherited from previous generations. The identification of archaeological layers beneath the basilica revealed even more. Fragments of pottery, Roman coins, tools and other objects dating back to the 1st century were found. This suggests that the site was occupied long before the church was built. The overlapping of eras and functions reveals a rare continuity in sites of this nature. It was as if the memory of the place had been preserved not only in the accounts, but also in the architectural decisions of those who came after. Another essential element was the presence of environments associated with hospitality. Archaeologists found remains that point to the existence of a complex, with spaces that possibly functioned as a hostel for travelers or monks. This aligns with common practices of Byzantine Christianity, which saw welcoming pilgrims as an expression of devotion and service. Places considered sacred were equipped to receive visitors, especially those coming from far away, in search of a direct spiritual experience. Further into the excavations, something even more revealing emerged. Among the mosaic floors, 3 inscriptions in Greek were recovered. 2 were damaged, but one remained almost intact, preserving not only the shape of the letters, but the theological content it conveyed. This inscription made direct reference to Peter, calling him Chief of the Apostles and holder of the keys of heaven. The language was formal, liturgical, and the context made it clear that this was not just any tribute, but an affirmation of that character's unique position in the history of the Christian faith. This finding raised the value of the discovery to a new level. Until that time, the site's main relevance was linked to its possible association with ancient Bethsaida. With the inscription, there was a bridge between the apostolic past and the veneration that was consolidated in the following centuries. What was once a hypothesis took shape with the materialization of a revered memory, transformed into text and inserted into the heart of a church. The use of Greek instead of Latin is also noteworthy. The choice of language reveals not only the geographical location of the community that built the basilica, but also its cultural context. Greek was widely used in the liturgies and theological records of Eastern Christian communities. This reinforces the idea that veneration of Peter as a figure of leadership was not an idea restricted to the Western world or the axis of Roman influence. It was something shared, widespread, and accepted among Eastern Christians. The methodology applied in the excavations followed strict criteria. The objects were catalogued according to the layers in which they were found, allowing archaeologists to draw a precise timeline for the different phases of occupation of the site. The presence of coins, for example, served as a reliable chronological marker. Many of them dated from the 4th to 6th centuries, which coincides with the period of intense Christian activity in the region, when churches began to be built on places considered sacred. The symbolic importance of building a basilica on the remains of an earlier village is significant. In the early Christian world, such a building functioned as a public declaration of faith and memory. It was a way of saying, something sacred happened here. By identifying and preserving this site, Byzantine Christians demonstrated not only reverence for the past, but also a desire to ensure that it would not be forgotten. What was recorded in stone, even though buried for centuries, now emerges with force and clarity. If you're enjoying the video so far, write Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you're following and participating with us. The rebirth of El Araj as a landmark is not just an archaeological event. It is also a movement of rediscovery. A site that had long remained invisible to modern eyes is beginning to be recognized again. Not as an isolated ruin, but as part of a larger group of sites where faith, history, and tradition intertwine. This re-emergence restores the site to its historical and spiritual dignity and repositions its role within the Christian narrative. As more details emerge, our understanding of what El Araj represents deepens. What seemed like a search for stones becomes an encounter with a time when faith and space were deeply intertwined. It is not just about digging in the ground, but about touching the living history of a people who built, prayed, and preserved the memory of one of the central figures of the Christian tradition. And this memory, far from being abstract, is now revealed in the solidity of ancient walls, the precision of forgotten inscriptions, and the persistence of a legacy that has withstood the test of time. The discovery of the inscription inside the Basilica of El Araj added a whole new dimension to what was already considered a site of high archaeological value. Up until that point, the elements found indicated a relevant place of worship, linked to the Eastern Christian tradition. But the presence of such a well-preserved inscription, containing an explicit statement about Peter, magnified the importance of the discovery. More than archaeology, what was revealed there was a milestone in theology and Christian memory. The inscription was carefully crafted into a circular mosaic, surrounded by geometric patterns and soft colors. It was written in Greek, the dominant language in Eastern Christian communities during the first centuries of the Common Era. The content, though brief, was loaded with meaning. It referred to Peter as chief of the apostles and holder of the keys of heaven. It was not an embellishment or a generic symbolic expression, but a clear and forceful theological statement placed in the context of worship and veneration. These titles attributed to Peter were not used lightly. By calling him the chief of the apostles, the text distinguishes him from the other disciples, giving him a unique leadership role. The reference to the keys is equally striking, as it directly refers to the passage in the Gospel, according to Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, where Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This image, widely used in the Christian tradition, carries the sense of spiritual authority and responsibility over the community of faith. The fact that such expressions appear in an Eastern context, before the formal separation between the Western and Eastern churches, shows that the idea of Peter's primacy was already circulating long before the institutional conflicts that would mark the following centuries. This contradicts the view that this conception originated exclusively in Rome as part of the construction of the papacy. On the contrary, the mosaic suggests that the recognition of Peter as a central figure was a reality shared by various Christian groups, including in the region where the apostle himself lived. The mosaic also mentions the name of a certain Constantine, probably a local patron who financed the paving of the church. The text asks Peter to intercede for him and his sons, demonstrating that, for that community, the apostle was not just a historical figure, but an intercessor present in everyday spirituality. This form of devotion, rooted in the practice of Byzantine Christianity, reinforces the idea that the place was important not only for tradition, but for a living experience of faith. The structure of the language used in the inscription is liturgical. That is, it was carefully crafted to align with usage within religious practice. It is not a common administrative or memorial inscription. It has a devotional tone and dogmatic content. This shows that the mosaic was not merely decorative, but was intended to communicate a truth recognized and celebrated by the community. The use of specific titles and the direct invocation of Peter as intercessor leave no room for vague interpretations. Historically, the words engraved there contribute to the understanding of the formation of Christian identity. The centrality of Peter in discussions about authority, apostolic succession, and unity of the Church has always been a point of divergence between different Christian traditions. The inscription offers a piece of information that goes beyond the realm of speculation. It represents physical evidence, located in Judeo-Christian territory, that confirms the circulation and acceptance of ideas that shaped the first centuries of Christian theology. From a theological point of view, the use of the term for Peter as leader of the apostles is particularly significant. In Greek, the word used suggests not only respect, but formal leadership. This is an expression associated with the idea of spiritual leadership, not as a symbolic title, but as practical recognition of a leadership role. This does not eliminate the role of the other apostles, but it places Peter in a distinct position, which helps to understand why his figure became so central in the Western tradition. This recognition in a region of the Christian East, very close to the events narrated in the Gospels, also highlights the role of oral tradition in preserving the memory of the first disciples. The communities that lived in Galilee transmitted stories, teachings, and geographical references that influenced decisions about where to build churches and how to represent them. The mosaic reflects this continuity of memory, a link between the biblical texts and the concrete practice of the following generations. From an archaeological point of view, the clarity of the inscription and its excellent state of preservation are remarkable factors. It is rare for mosaics dating back more than 1,400 years to survive in such clarity. This suggests that the basilica may have been covered or abandoned suddenly, protecting the interior elements from the effects of time. Furthermore, the fact that the church was built over older remains reinforces the theory that there was a deliberate intention to preserve a site associated with the story of Peter. The sum of these elements creates a scene of unparalleled value. The mosaic, at once simple and profound, connects archaeology with theology, the past with living faith. It reveals how the figure of Peter was perceived by Christians who lived in their own land, far from the ecclesiastical disputes that would develop in later centuries. And it does so not through modern interpretations, but through the language of its own time, engraved in stone, in full view of all who set foot on that sacred ground. By bringing to light an inscription that names Peter as a central figure among the apostles, the excavation at El Araj has provoked an echo far beyond the confines of archaeology. The theological content engraved in mosaic not only reinforced the memory of a biblical figure, but also rekindled discussions that have accompanied Christianity since its early centuries. Each Christian movement interprets Peter's authority based on different traditions, and this finding began to be observed through different lenses. In the Catholic field, the recognition of Peter as a spiritual leader and bearer of the keys to the kingdom of heaven is one of the foundations of the papacy. This doctrine is supported by passages such as that of the Gospel according to Matthew, and throughout history, it has served as a basis for establishing the authority of the Bishop of Rome as the direct successor of Peter. In this sense, the inscription discovered in El Araj offers material reinforcement to what for centuries was supported by texts and oral tradition. For many Catholic theologians, it is an important confirmation that the veneration of Peter as a spiritual leader already existed in a solid form in the Christian East, well before the formalization of the Roman ecclesiastical hierarchy. On the other hand, Protestant communities view this same episode from a different perspective. The 16th century Reformation challenged the centrality of the papacy, arguing that spiritual authority should be shared among all believers or based solely on Scripture. While recognizing the importance of Peter, these traditions do not attribute to him an exclusive leadership role over the other apostles. From this perspective, the discovery at El Araj is seen as a regional expression of devotion, not as a testimony that justifies later structures of authority. Orthodox churches, on the other hand, offer an intermediate approach. Although they honor Peter as one of the foremost disciples of Christ, they do not support the idea of a universal primacy such as that claimed by the papacy. For the Orthodox, spiritual authority is distributed among the patriarchs of the different ecclesiastical sees, with an emphasis on the collegiality of the bishops. The Greek inscription found at El Araj, written in the context of the Byzantine tradition, is received with interest, but interpreted as part of a local devotion rather than as an argument in debates about jurisdiction. The impact of the discovery extends even further into the academic community. Religious historians and patristic scholars have begun to review ancient pilgrim accounts that mention churches dedicated to Peter and Andrew in the Galilee region. For a long time, these testimonies were seen as unreliable or exaggerated. Now, with the identification of a basilica built on that site and the content of the inscriptions, many of these medieval texts have gained new credibility. This convergence between written tradition and archaeological remains is a rare phenomenon. Throughout Christian history, there have been numerous points of tension between faith and evidence. In this case, however, the inscription not only confirms a long-held belief, but also helps to reconstruct the way in which early Christians related to sacred space. The fact that communities in the Christian East dedicated a church to the memory of Peter indicates that his figure was more than symbolic. He occupied a place of practical relevance in local worship and theology. In addition to the doctrinal implications, there is also an important cultural element. The way in which 5th century Christians built their churches, chose the words for the inscriptions, and designated the patrons of the buildings reveals much about what they valued. They not only remembered Peter, but attributed to him an active spiritual role, asking for his intercession for those who participated in the construction of the church. This shows a living relationship with the apostolic figure, which goes beyond historical remembrance and becomes a link between generations. The contemporary repercussions of the discovery have also stimulated debates at universities, interfaith forums, and ecumenical meetings. In an increasingly fragmented Christian world, evidence like this can act as points of dialogue. Although it does not eliminate theological differences, it offers the possibility of reflecting on the common origin of certain beliefs. The inscription at El Araj reminds us that before institutional divisions, there was a shared tradition that recognized the importance of certain figures and places. Furthermore, the archaeological context lends solidity to the argument. This is not a tradition transmitted only by manuscripts copied over the centuries, but a message set in stone, preserved for over 1400 years, in a real place of worship, attended by living communities. This reinforces the argument that certain theological ideas were already in circulation in key regions of the Christian world, well before they were consolidated by councils or doctrinal disputes. The inscription is, therefore, a meeting point between different times and voices. It speaks of the past, but echoes in the present. It calls not only religious people, but also historians, linguists, theologians, and archaeologists. It raises questions about how memory is formed, transmitted, and recorded. And above all, it reveals that, even on the shores of a remote lake, there were firm convictions about who Peter was and what his role was within the faith that was born there. Over the centuries, many certainties have been built on interpretations, traditions, and fragments that have survived the test of time. But there are rare moments when the soil itself responds, offering more than ruins. It delivers meaning. El Araj is one such place. The inscription rescued from the depths of the earth not only reinforces a familiar narrative, but also challenges old conventions, opening space for reinterpretation, dialogue, and above all, humility in the face of the complexity of the history of faith. The way this inscription presents itself is, in itself, a lesson. It does not shout, it does not impose. It stands silently in a mosaic that, for so long, remained out of sight. And yet, it carries a theological and historical weight that many documents never achieve. While theories change and positions adjust over the generations, what was carved in stone remains as a testimony to a time when the sacred was inseparable from the landscape. Seeing Peter named as a leading figure among the apostles, so close to the place where he began his journey, not only arouses curiosity, but forces us to consider how the first communities actually remembered their origins. This memory, far from being abstract, was imprinted in concrete forms in buildings, words, and devotional practices. The El Araj mosaic is more than an expression of faith. It is also a record of what Christians of that time understood about authority, continuity, and spiritual presence. Archaeology, in this context, not only illuminates the past, it also questions the present. What other truths are hidden beneath the rubble of time? To what extent is what we consider definitive, in fact, based on solid roots? The discovery at El Araj does not resolve all debates, but it does offer a tangible reference, a reliable starting point for new reflections on themes that still divide traditions, but which also connect them through a common heritage. There is something deeply human in the effort to preserve memories. When a community chooses where to build its temple, what words to inscribe on its floor, and to whom to dedicate its prayers, it is revealing what it considers essential. The mosaic in question reveals a people who not only knew Peter's story, but who carried it with them as a living heritage, worthy of being honored in every detail. In light of this, perhaps the greatest lesson is to realize that faith, history, and memory do not belong to fixed structures, but live in movement, shaped by the hands of those who believe, build, and remember. The inscription speaks not only of Peter, but also of the human search for meaning, identity, and belonging. As the centuries continue to pass and other discoveries wait to emerge, this small open window in El Araj invites us to look at the past with new eyes. Not to judge or claim, but to understand. Because sometimes what was left underground was not forgotten, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. And now that it has, perhaps the most important thing is not just what was found, but what we do with what it means. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.